Okay, this is going to be the sample video, 2020 trig graphs. Before I go on to any of the graphs, I want to go through the basic values because this component is going to be important for when we go through the values. So when I list out the values, this is sort of the concept. So I'm going to do this at the end, okay? So for sine, and we went over these in class, is the basic values for sine are 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. That will give you your first period, okay? And then what you do to repeat that is you just go from the 4 down, 1, 0, -1, 0, okay? For cosine, okay, what you have is 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. And to keep on going, you do 0, -1, 0, 1. That's 2 periods. Okay? Cosecant. Okay? Cosecant, you're going to go undefined, 1, undefined, -1, undefined. Okay, then go 1, undefined, -1, undefined. Okay, and these will actually be the same values for secant and cosecant, and we went over that in class. And we'll talk about how you start that. Okay, for tangent, okay, the period is only a pi. The periods for these are 2 pi. Okay, so these are all the periods of these functions. Okay, so for tangent, okay, you would start out with undefined, -1. 0, 1, and undefined. Okay, if you keep that going, it's -1, 0, 1, then undefined to finish. Okay? Alright, cotangent also has a period. Cotangent also has a period of pi. Okay, that's going to be undefined, 1, 0, -1, undefined. Take these 4, keep them going. 1, 0, -1, undefined. Okay, so those are your key values. Okay, those are the measurement, the values that you need to have. All right, we're going to be referencing those as we go. We already talked about those in class, sort of how to start with. Okay, all right, so let me go back to these beginning examples. Okay, all right, so the amplitude is just the number in front here, so this would be 1. The first thing I want to do is to figure out my phase shift for cosine. What I do is I take this and set it equal to 0, whatever inside the parentheses. So that would be 2x equals -pi, x equals -pi over 2. Okay? All right? So I'm going to build the values over here. Okay? So I'm working with cosine, so it's 1, 0, -1, 0, 1, 1, I'm sorry, 0, -1, 0, and 1. Okay, so my first value, my first angle measurement will be -pi over 2. Okay, first angle measurement. Now, to find the period, I take 2 pi for this and divide by the number that's in front of x, which happens to be 2. So my period will be 1 pi. My phase shift for cosine is going to be the starting value of -pi over 2. My vertical shift will be this -3 here, okay? All right, and we'll get to domain and range once we make the graph, okay? Now, to figure out my interval, this is important. To figure out my interval, okay, I take the period and divide by 4 all the time. So in this case, it would be 1 pi divided by 4, which would be 1 pi over 4, okay? We talked about this in class as we go, all right? If you want to use fractions, all right, without the pi's, because they're all going to have them, that might be an easier way for you to go. So what I want to do is I want to start with -1/2, and I want to add 1/4. Now the way that's going to happen is a common denominator of -2 over 4 plus 1/4 will be -1/4. Okay, so that's going to be -pi over 4. Okay, and then -1/4 plus 1/4 would be 0. 0 plus 1/4 would be 1/4. Okay, so I got to put 0 in there, and then pi over 4. Okay, then 1/4 plus 1/4 is 2/4, or 1/2 pi. pi over 2. Okay, 2/4 plus 1/4 is 3/4. Okay, 3/4 plus 1/4 is 4/4 or 1. Plus 1/4 would be 5/4. Okay, so this would be 1 pi, 5/4 pi, and then 5/4 plus 1/4 is 6/4 or 3/2 pi. Okay, now I also, because of this, I want to subtract 3 by all these. So now this would be -2, -3, -4, -3, -2, -3, -4, -3, -2. Okay, so just graph those. Okay, now if you look at where you're starting from negative pi over 2. All right, and then that means we're going to go pi over 2. Okay, we're going to end at 3 pi, so that's going to be 1 pi, 3 pi over 2. Now as you can see, I've got quarters in there, so let's just cut these into quarters. Okay, 1/4, 3/4, 5/4, and over here would be -1/4. Okay, all right, so simply just have to graph it. -1/2, I'm going to be at -2. At negative pi over 3, I'm going to be at -3. At 0, I'm going to be at -4. At 1/4, I'm going to be back at -3. At 1/2, I'm going to be at -2. At 3/4, I'm going to be at -3. At 1 pi, I'm going to be at -4. At 5/4 pi, I'm going to be at -3. And 3/2 pi, I'm going to be back up at -2. So this is what my graph looks like. Okay, from a domain standpoint, that's going to be -infinity to infinity, and my range goes between -4 and -2, okay, with the closed bracket. Okay. All right. So in this case, my amplitude would be 2 because I got that in front there. I'm going to take this x minus pi over 2, set it equal to 0, which would just be pi over 2. That is going to be my starting value, my starting angle. Okay, so pi over 2, that's also my phase shift. Okay, the period, I got to figure out the period, which is 2 pi, divided by the number in front of x, which in this case is 2, which I'll be at 2 pi. Okay, my interval will be the 2 pi divided by 4, which would be a pi over 2. Okay, would be the interval. Okay, all right. So my period is 2 pi. My vertical shift happens to be 4. Since it's sine, we know that it's -infinity to infinity. Okay, we'll talk about the range in a second. So for sine, I'm 0, I'm 1, I'm 0, I'm -1, I'm 0. That would be 1 period. Continue with these 4, 1, 0, -1, and 0. Okay? Now I just got to get the angles, maybe to change my values a little bit here. All right, so I'm starting at pi over 2, okay, which is really 1/2. So I'm going to add a 1/2 pi and a 1/2 pi, which would give me 2 over 2, okay, which would be 1. Okay, all right, then 2 over 2 plus 1 over 2 would be 3 over 2. 3 over 2 plus 1 over 2 would be 4 over 2. Okay, so 3 over 2 pi, 2 over 2 pi, which would be 4 over 2 pi, which would be 2 pi. Okay, 4 over 2 plus 1 over 2 is 5 over 2. So that's 5/2 pi. 5 over 2 plus 1 over 2 is 6 over 2, which 6 over 2 would be 3 pi. All right, 6 over 2 plus 1 over 2, 7 over 2, 7/2 pi. 7 over 2 plus 1 over 2 is 8 over 2, which would be 4 pi. And 8 over 2 plus 1 over 2 is 9 over 2. Okay, so as you can see, I'm going from pi over 2 all the way up to about 4.5 pi. So I'm going to, all right, I'm going to be pi over 2 here, 1 pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, they work in odd increments. 3 pi, 7 pi over 2. I'm going to erase this so we don't need that anymore. Give me a second for the board to reset. I'm just going to clear this out. Okay, 7 over 2, then 4 pi, 9 over 2, and then that would be obviously 5 pi. So they work in increments, they're like in odd increments there. Now, what's going to happen to my values here? I'm going to multiply by 2 first. Okay, and then I'm going to add 4. So it's now going to be 4, 6, 4, 2, 4, 6, 4, 2, 4. Okay, so I don't need these anymore. Okay, all right, so at pi over 2, I'm up at 4. At pi, I'm at 6. At 3 pi over 2, I'm at 4. At 2 pi, I'm at 2. At 5 pi over 2, I'm at 4. At 3 pi over 2, or 3 pi, I'm at 6. At 7 pi over 2, I'm at 4. At 4 pi, I'm at 2. At 9 pi over 2, at 4. So this is what my graph looks like. Okay, 2 periods. Okay, my range will be between 2 and 6. Okay, tangent, okay. All right, my amplitude for here will be 1, okay. If I take this, okay, now tangent, we got to set it equal to negative pi over 2 when I'm going to find like the starting value. Okay, so what happens here is that would be x equals negative 2 pi over 2, because this basically comes up, okay, which would give me negative pi, okay, is where my starting value will be. Okay, now to figure out my phase shift, I would still set this equal to 0. Okay. All right, so my phase shift actually is 0 when I cross multiply that. So the phase shift, this is where it's a little bit unique with tangent. Okay, my starting value for there, or angle for there, is still going to be, negative pi. Okay, all right, but my phase shift has changed. Okay, or does not change in this case. It's going to be 0. All right, the period. Okay, I take 1 pi. Okay, divided by the number in front of x, which happens to be a half. Okay, so what ends up happening there, when you flip that fraction, that's going to end up being, the period is going to be 2 pi. Okay, to get my interval, I'm going to take 2 pi and divide it by 4, which happens to be pi over 2. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take negative 1, okay, and add pi over 2, or negative 1 pi, which if I get a common denominator there, I have to multiply this by this. So that's going to be negative 2 over 2, plus 1 would be negative 1 over 2, or negative 1/2. Okay, so let's put our values in also for tangent. So my values for tangent would be undefined, negative 1, 0, 1, undefined. Continue, negative 1, 0, 1, undefined. Okay, so this would be negative pi over 2. Okay, so negative 1/2 plus a half would be 0. 0 plus a half would be a half. A half plus 1/2 is 2 halves, or 1. 2 halves plus 1/2 is 3 halves. 3 halves pi. 3 halves plus 1/2 is 4 halves, so 2 pi. And then 4 halves plus 1/2 5/2. Okay, and then 5/2 plus 1/2 is 6/2 or 3 pi. So I'm going all the way from negative pi over 2, pi over 2, 1 pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, 3 pi. Okay? Alright? Now, the other thing that's going to happen too, I'm not going to have, my vertical shift here is 3. So I would add 3 to these. The undefined stay, so this will now be 2, 3, 4. Okay, still undefined. Okay, 2, 3, 4, still undefined. Okay, so at negative pi, alright, I'm there. Okay, I'm there. And then at negative pi over 2, okay, I'm at negative 1. Okay. I'm sorry, not at pi over 2, I'm sorry, I'm at 2. Sorry, didn't count for that. So 2, okay, at 0, I'm at 3. At pi over 2, I'm all the way up at 4. 1 pi, I'm undefined. At 3 pi over 2, I'm at 2. At 2 pi, I'm at 3. And 5 pi over 2, I'm at 4. And at 3 pi, I'm undefined. Okay, so what my graph looks like this. Okay. All right, so my domain, all right, my range is easy. Range is going to be all real numbers. Okay. My domain is x, such that x can't be, okay, x can't be my first asymptote, which is negative pi, plus n, okay, times my period of 2 pi, okay, all right, where n is an integer. Okay, there's the range, there's the graph. Okay. All right, let's do secant. Okay, secant, just like tangent, is a little unique in that when we find our starting value by doing 3x plus 2 pi, we got to set it equal to negative pi over 2, which that's going to be 3x minus pi over 2 minus 2 pi. Okay. All right, which would be, if I do a common denominator, that's going to be 4 over 2, so 3x equals negative 5 pi over 2, okay, and that would be x, when I divide that, x is negative 5 pi over 6, okay, all right, so that's going to be my first angle, is negative 5 pi over 6, all right. So for secant, it's just like cosecant. We're going to be undefined 1, undefined negative 1, undefined. So 1, undefined, negative 1, undefined. Okay, so that's what I'm going to have there. My starting value will be at that. Okay, I would still want to figure out what my phase shift would be. Okay. 3x equals negative 2 pi, all right, x equals negative 2 pi over 3. Okay, all right, so my phase shift is negative 2 pi over 3. Okay, my amplitude will be 4. The period of my function, okay, the period of my function will be 2 pi divided by the number that's in front of that, which would be 2 pi over 3. Be the period. Okay, my interval will be 2 pi over 3 divided by 4, which would be 2 pi over basically 12, which is pi over 6. Okay, so that's going to be my interval of pi over 6. Okay, all right. So to figure that out, I would start at negative 5 over 6 plus 1/6 would be negative 4/6 or negative 2/3. Okay, negative 4/6 plus 1/6 is negative 3/6 or negative 1/2. Okay, 1/6, oh sorry, negative 3/6 plus 1/6 is negative 2/6 or negative 1 or negative pi over 3. Okay, negative 2/6 plus 1/6 is negative 1/6. Okay, or negative pi over 6. Okay, negative 1/6 plus a 6 will be 0. 1/6 or 0 plus 1/6 will be 1/6. Okay, so we got 0 here, pi over 6. Okay, and 1/6 plus 1/6 is 2/6 or 1/3. And then 2/6 plus 1/6 is 3/6, or that's pi over 2. Okay, now what you need to be careful on. Okay, what you need to be careful on is we're going from negative pi over 6 to pi over 2. You might want to give yourself a little bit of space here. That's negative 1 pi. That's negative pi over 2. Okay, and this is going to be pi over 2 all the way over here. Now, when you cut this in quarters, okay, all right, now, if the decimals help you, okay, if the decimals help you, okay, this will be 0.25, all right, this will be negative 0.25, this will be negative 0.75, all right. Now, something that you have to understand is that 1/6 is like 0.1 something, okay, 2/6 is easy, that's just 1/3, which is 0.3, right? All right, 3/6 is just a half, which that's easy, that's going to be 0.5, okay, 4/6 is 2/3, which is about 0.6. 5/6 is about 0.8. So as far as your decimal goes, that can help you, okay? Now, what else is going to happen to my value since I have that 4 in there? I don't have a vertical shift in here, but this is now going to be 4, negative 4, 4, negative 4. These other parts are just going to stay undefined. So at negative 5/6, which is negative 0.8, which would be right here, I'm going to be undefined. At negative 2/3, which is negative 0.6, if you think of it that way, that would be right here. I'm going to be up at 4. At negative 1/2, I'm going to be undefined. At negative pi over 3, which is negative 0.3, which would be on this side here, I'm going to be at negative 4. At negative 1/6, or negative 0.1, I'm going to be undefined. Okay, at 0, I'm going to be up at 4. At 0.6 or 1/6, I'm going to be undefined, which would be right there. At 1/3, I'd be at negative 4, which is going to be 0.3, which would be there. And 1/2, I'm going to be there. So this is what I have. Boom, 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 boom. Okay? So my range, okay, my range goes from negative infinity to negative 4 with a union of 4 to infinity. Okay, now my domain will be all x such that x can't be my first asymptote, which was negative 5/6, plus n times my period. Okay, all right, my period here, let's find that, was pi over 3 divided by 2. Okay, which would be like pi over 6, or 2 pi over 6. Let me clear this out. Hold on. Clear this stuff out so I can write better. Okay, so the way that works for this one is you take this part, it's plus n times, you take your period, which you take your period divided by 2, which in my case was negative 5, 6. No, I'm sorry, not negative 5, 6. It was 2/3 divided by 2, which is 2, which would be, this 2 would come underneath, there would be 6, which would be pi over 3. Where n is an element of integers. And the way that works is if it's 2, let's say it's 2 pi over 6, just for the fraction standpoint, okay? Either one would be fine, I wouldn't be picky on that. Is that my negative 5, 6 pi, if I put 0 in there, and obviously that's where that first one's going to be. If I put 1 in there, that'd be 2 6 plus negative 1 6, okay? Which 2 6 plus, or negative 5 6 plus 2 6 is negative 3 6, which is negative pi over 2. And as you can see, that's where my next one is, okay? All right, so that's sort of the idea. If you put that as 2 pi over 6, I would be fine with that, okay? All right, cosecant, the convenient part there is my values are still undefined, 1, undefined, negative 1, undefined, draw the line, 1, undefined, negative 1, undefined, okay? Now I can set, this is easy now because now that's going to be set equal to 0, so 4x equals negative pi. My first is negative pi over 4. That's also my phase shift. My amplitude is 1, my vertical shift is negative 2. My period is 2 pi divided by the number in front of x, so in this case it's 4, which would be pi over 2. Okay? To get my interval, I take my pi over 2 and divide it by 4, which would be pi over 8. Okay? All right. Before I get that, let's get the values in there. That might just be easier to do first. So now this will just be negative 1. This will be negative 3, negative 1, and negative 3, because I would just be subtracting 2. That's all I have to do on that. Okay, so battle of fractions. All right, negative 1/4 plus 1/8. Okay, so that would be negative 2/8 plus 1/8 would be negative 1/8. Okay, so negative pi over 8. Okay, all right, negative 1/8 plus 1/8 would be 0. 0 plus 1/8 would be 1/8. 1/8 plus 1/8 would be 2/8. Okay, so I got 0, 1/8 pi, 2/8 pi is pi over 4. Okay, then 2/8 plus 1/8 is 3/8. 3/8 plus 1/8 is 4/8 or a half. Okay, so this would be 3/8 pi. This would be pi over 2. Okay, 4/8 plus 1/8 is about 5/8, and 5/8 plus 1/8 is 6/8. Okay, so 5 pi over 8, and that would be 3 pi over 4. So as you can see, I'm not going very far here, so I might spread this out just a little bit. Negative pi, negative pi over 2, pi over 2, 1 pi. Okay, as you can see, I have eighths, so I got to cut them in quarters first. So 1/4, 3/4, negative 1/4, negative 3/4. All right, 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, 7/8, negative 1/8, negative 3/8, negative 5/8, negative 7/8. Okay, all right. So at negative 1/4. Okay, I'm at undefined. At negative 1/8, I'm now at negative 1. So be here. At 0, I'm going to be undefined. At 1/8, I'm going to be at negative 3. At 1/4, I'm going to be undefined. At 3/8, I'm going to be at negative 1. At 1/2, I'm going to be undefined. At 5/8, I'm going to be at negative 1. And then at 3/4, I'm going to be undefined. So this is what I got. I'm going to go this way, this way, this way, and this way. Okay, my range, it's a negative infinity to negative 3 with a union of -1 to infinity, okay? For these, it would be x can't be, all right, my first asymptote at -1/4, okay, all right? And then I got my period, which my period of this function will be pi over 2, and I would divide that by 2, which would be pi over 4, so it would be plus n times pi over 4, where n is an element of integers.